So it is data analysis time for round number 3, the Australian Grand Prix. So if any of you guys are new to this series, I basically compile all of the race data that I can really grab my hands on and pit the teammates against one another to see exactly how well they have performed. As well as giving just a short general race overview as well to see exactly how well the entire grid did. Everything is all timestamped in the description down below, so please do feel free to skip to whichever segment of the video you'd like me to talk about. But without further ado, let us jump on into the race data overview, and we start with the positions table. And honestly, it is a very boring positions table, and one that is akin to all of the previous Australian Grand Prix, where we have a completely unbroken lead for Charles Leclerc from start to finish, his first ever Grand Slam. And then after lap 38 and lap 39, there isn't a great deal of positional movements, especially from the top 10. It was only really when the first safety car came out in the early stages of the Grand Prix where there was the majority of the position changes. And so taking a look at the overall lap time chart, we can see those first two safety cars that happened early on in the Grand Prix, and then the short virtual safety car period at laps 38 to 40. But just zooming in on the section of racing that we are most interested in, we can see that Charles Leclerc was so dominant during this Grand Prix. He is of course that small light blue line at the very bottom, highlighted here by the dark blue arrows. He is in a league of his own in stint number 1, at times a second per lap faster than everybody else. He then carries this advantage, although somewhat smaller, into stint number 2, where again he is at the lower red arrow and he's around half a second per lap faster than everybody else. But each of these arrows are highlighting what are called bands of racing, where we end up with the field actually being split into unique pace bands. We usually have the front runners, they are band number 1, we then have the midfield, and then we have the back markers as well. But very occasionally we have the midfield, which splits itself up into either 2 or even 3 of its own bands of racing. Which, if we head back to the lap time chart, in the final stint after the virtual safety car, we can see that there are 4 bands of racing. There is again Charles Leclerc on his own. There is then the small front runners pack, there is then the main midfield pack, and then there are the back markers. So we can see how Charles Leclerc always had a huge advantage over everybody else in this Grand Prix, and how there was a lot of pace differences throughout this race as well. But what I want to now take a look at is the overall stint breakdown of every single driver. So rather than looking at the whole Grand Prix as a whole, let's break it down into all of the stints to see who was going quicker in each of the phases of this Grand Prix. And that would look something a bit like this. We've got Charles Leclerc on the mediums leading in stint number 1, and then leading quite convincingly in stint number 2 on the hards by a little over 0.6 of a second. It was then Fernando Alonso and Nicholas Latifi who were the only 2 drivers to do a majority stint number 3. We did have Lance Stroll do a couple of stints, but seeing as only one of them was a lap on the mediums behind the safety car, I haven't decided to count it as an official stint. But just note that Albon does pop up quite high into the stint 1 leaderboard, but that is because he did the entirety of the Grand Prix on the hards, bar the final lap. But certainly for Mercedes to appear above Sergio Perez on the medium compound of tyres, with Lewis Hamilton being half a tenth quicker, that is encouraging for their progress into this season. We then interestingly get Fernando Alonso ahead of the 2 McLarens. So really, if he hadn't have had that accident in qualifying, which was allegedly caused by a small little oil O-ring, which cost a little over £1, that's really gonna hurt them quite a lot. Just think what they could have actually achieved had he managed to get that lap in at the end of qualifying. But now my next step is to combine each of these 3 stints and average every single driver's lap time, excluding all of the safety cars and virtual safety cars. We then end up with a leaderboard that looks a bit like this. Leclerc's average lap time, excluding the pit stops, virtual safety cars and safety cars like I just said, is a 1:22.449. 7.5 tenths. 7.5 tenths faster than Sergio Perez, who set a 1:23.187. Like, I personally can't quite comprehend how dominant Charles Leclerc was in this weekend. Like, it wasn't just a lights to flag victory. it was just pure domination from Charles Leclerc. This is domination that we haven't really seen for a long time. I know we've had Mercedes leading for such a long period of time, but they have never really led by this much of a margin before. Now, of course, that would help by the fact that Max Verstappen retired very early on, as if we go back to the leaderboard, he is down behind the two Mercedes, but that's because he retired after just completing a little over 50%. That's 50% of the overall race distance. But what we can do now is we can take that percentage gap column and we can plot it onto a graph and compare it to the first 2 rounds of this season, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, to represent the overall field spread. And we can see that excluding Sebastian Vettel and then the previous outlier from Saudi Arabia, that the field spread is actually fairly representative. Although here in Australia we have a ludicrous gap between P2 and P1, where this gap is usually the difference between P3 or 4 and P1. But then what we can do is we can average out each of the drivers' individual dots and we can see who's been the fastest so far across this season, which unsurprisingly, it's Charles Leclerc, 0.3% faster per racing lap than his teammate Carlos Sainz, and 0.5% quicker than Sergio Perez, who is quicker than Max Verstappen. Now, once again, the impact of the retirements are going to hinder Max Verstappen in this, and also Red Bull, as they have retired from 3 out of the 6 chances that they have had. But it is Mercedes who find themselves a little over 1% per lap off of the leaders Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, but they are comfortably the 3rd fastest car, as there is then quite a significant gap to Esteban Ocon and Kevin Magnussen. But now what we can do is we can take a look at the overall clean air laps that were set outside of a small window of the car in front, where you're in that dirty air and you are being held up. Now, in order to find this, I have isolated the lap times that were set outside of 1.5 seconds of the car in front, and then once again average those across all of the 3 stints. Again, excluding all of the safety car and virtual safety car periods. We then end up with a table that looks a bit like this. So Leclerc again leading both stint number 1 and stint number 2, but no longer by as hefty a margin as he did before. We had Sergio Perez being much closer in stint number 2. Now again, Alex Albon pops up really highly in stint number 1, but that's because he completed the entire race distance after achieving quite a lot of his clean air laps in the last 50% of the Grand Prix, where his car is really light on fuel. So it wasn't really a standard or an orthodox stint number 1. And so with the general race overview all done and dusted, we'll now break down each of the teammates. We're going in 2021 Constructors' Championship order, so we start with Mercedes and we're going to end with Haas. For this Australian Grand Prix and all of the races forthcoming, I will actually be including some race telemetry data. This is a new addition for this episode. And then again, for those new to this series, I'll be explaining each of the 4 graphs that will be popping up in the Mercedes panel only, and then breaking everything down for the rest of the teammates. So on screen is the Mercedes panel for the comparison between Lewis Hamilton in the black lines and George Russell in the turquoise. So in the top left we have the overall Mercedes lap time chart, which denotes their lap time on every single lap of this Grand Prix. Then in the top right we have their positions chart, which denotes their position at the end of every single lap of the Grand Prix. We then have the Mercedes gaps chart in the bottom left, which denotes the delta between the 2 drivers on every lap of this race. And then in the bottom right we have the percentage pace difference between Hamilton to Russell. Now this percentage pace difference will take all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, divide them all by George Russell's lap times, and convert them into a percentage. Any percentage above 100 is where Lewis Hamilton is going quicker, and then any percentage below 100 is where George Russell is going quicker. These percentages are then ordered from largest down to smallest, and we end up with the distribution that is shown on screen. And what we can do is we can split this percentage pace difference down the middle and see that for 46.6% of the laps raced together, it was George Russell who was the faster Mercedes, and therefore for 53.4% it was Lewis Hamilton. So a fairly even split between the 2 Mercedes, and something that has actually happened more often than not this season so far. And we can see in stint number 1 they were actually pretty much dead even, with the gap holding holding at 2 seconds right up until the first safety car period. Which is actually where Lewis Hamilton lost out to George Russell, having pitted that lap before the safety car came out, where Russell benefited massively. Then in stint number 2, George Russell was actually able to open up this gap to a little over 4 seconds, however the virtual safety car wiped this out, and again for stint number 3, the gap held at a little under 2 seconds all the way to the end of the race. But interestingly, Mercedes showed some lap time progression from stint number 1 and in stint number 2, but interestingly not a great deal in stint number 3 where their lap times held at a 1 minute 22. But now taking a look at the Mercedes lap time telemetry for their fastest racing laps from Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, we can actually see quite a significant difference between the two drivers, with Hamilton in the turquoise and Russell in the black. Highlighted here by the yellow arrows on the speed trace in kilometers an hour is Lewis Hamilton backing off quite significantly into all of the major corners. The first yellow arrow is at turn 6, the middle yellow arrow is heading down to the turn 9 and 10 chicane, and then the final yellow arrow is heading into turn 11. Where interestingly just here on the brake trace we can actually see that Hamilton dabbed the brakes on the exit of turn 5 on the run down to turn 6. Then on their throttle trace just above, we can see that they were fairly sensible and fairly even. But notice here down on the gear trace that Hamilton actually chooses to ride a higher gear in certain sections of the Grand Prix compared to George Russell, and this isn't something that we see often in teammate telemetry comparisons. But another interesting lap to take a look at, it's actually lap 53. Now this is sector 2, again with Hamilton being in the turquoise and George Russell being in the black. So this shows the run from turn 6 all the way down to the 9 and 10 chicane. Now why I've chosen lap 53 is because Lewis Hamilton at this point was told to lift and coast, which we can see here in the speed trace in kilometers an hour where he backs off quite significantly before corner entry, and then here on the throttle trace where he comes off of the throttle much earlier, around 100 meters earlier into the corner than George Russell. Then heading into the final sector of the circuit, we can once again see this lifting and coasting from Lewis Hamilton, something that George Russell did not have to do. And we can see at the lap times it actually cost Hamilton half a second on lap 53, having to do all of this significant lifting and coasting, and even dabbing the brakes once after turn 11. However, with Hamilton actually coming off of the throttle much earlier, it allows him to come onto the throttle much earlier on the corner exit than George Russell, so he comes into the corner really slowly, and he is actually much more punchy on the exit than George Russell. But moving away from the telemetry of the Mercedes pair and taking a look at their overall clean air lap breakdown between stint number 1 and stint number 2 of the two drivers, we can see that it was George Russell in clean air that was the faster driver. However, if we actually take a look at their quarter distribution, we can see that Hamilton had 6 of his clean air laps in the first quarter of this Grand Prix, which are going to be significantly slower than those set in the second, third and fourth quarter, whereas George Russell's didn't set any, so the small delta of just a tenth could be wiped out by this difference. But it was George Russell over the full race distance that set the faster time in clean air to Lewis Hamilton. But comparing their clean air lap pace to their overall time excluding the clean air laps, both drivers were actually quicker in clean air, so they went slower when they weren't following a car. However, in stint number 2 it was Hamilton who lost 0.6 of a second when he was in clean air. Then from Mercedes we will take a look at Red Bull, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 36.8% it was Sergio Perez in the dark blue line who was the faster Red Bull, and therefore for 63.2% it was Max Verstappen. Now this percentage pace difference is only looking at the 38 full laps that these two drivers raced against one another, so it will not be looking at any of the laps raced when Max Verstappen retired. But taking a look at the stint number 1 breakdown, like Mercedes, the gap was holding quite nicely between the two drivers up until that first safety car period at 4 seconds. Then there was a bit of a confusing stage between the two drivers, with Verstappen coming into the pits, allowing Perez to overtake, and then Perez coming back into the pits, allowing Verstappen to retake the position. But then in stint number 2, we can see that both drivers were pretty much dead even, and then unfortunately Max Verstappen had his retirement, so we don't really know what he would have been able to do in stint 3. And so if we take a look at the Red Bull telemetry trace for their fastest laps, with Verstappen being in the blue and Perez being in the black, we can again see that much like the Mercedes trace, Verstappen just isn't pushing at all into the major braking zones. These are once again the braking zones into turn 6, the turn 9 and 10 chicane, and then turn 11. And we can see that on this occasion, Perez was able to set a lap time that was 6/10 quicker than Max Verstappen. And once again, we can see an enormous amount of lifting and coasting for Max Verstappen as he comes off of the throttle much earlier, around 50 to 100 meters earlier into the major corners than Sergio Perez. And then with a small dab of the brakes on the exit of turn number 6 on the run down to the 9 and 10 chicane, this is where most of his lap time was lost. But I just want to take a look at Max Verstappen's final full lap that he actually completed in this Grand Prix, which was lap number 38. And what we can see here, that right up until the run down to the turn 9 and 10 chicane is the two drivers Verstappen and Perez being absolutely dead even. This is represented by the delta trace at the top, which is the gap to Sergio Perez, where it is roughly about 2/10 in Max Verstappen's favour, but not really fluctuating. However, as we can see, he starts to significantly slow down halfway along this straight down to the turn 9 and 10 chicane. He then doesn't carry anywhere near as much speed down to turn 11, then through the tricky twisty sections of 12, 13 and 14 and the run down the final straight, he doesn't have as much speed as Sergio Perez. So this to me shows that the problem was visible to Red Bull a lot earlier than they made it out to be. They declared it to be a very quick and very sudden onset retirement. However, we can see on the delta traces and the speed traces that it was sort of visible almost an entire lap before it actually happened. Obviously not the exact cause of the retirement, but the fact that there was an issue with the car. So if I just show a zoomed in section of sector number 1, we can see in the throttle traces that Perez is a little bit slower actually, which is where he loses his 2/10 advantage to Max Verstappen. However, again, we can see Verstappen actually coming off the throttle much earlier into the corners and again riding the throttle harder on the exits. We're then heading down into sector number 2, this is where the problems start occurring with the large difference in speed, where this is roughly 20 to 30 kilometers an hour by the time they actually hit the braking of turn 9 and turn 10. But we can see that through the chicane, Verstappen actually does carry much more throttle than Sergio Perez. He is on the throttle much earlier through the chicane, but then has to back off quite significantly and actually dab the brakes on the exit, so he loses an awful lot of this pace that he carried into the corner. And then here in sector number 3, this is again where there is around a 20 to 30 kilometer an hour difference between the two drivers, mainly in the twiddly section between turn 11 and turn 14, where again we can see that Verstappen is coming off of the throttle around 50 to 75 meters earlier than Sergio Perez, but coming onto the throttle much sooner. It's just even coming onto the throttle much sooner, he's not experiencing the power demands that he normally would. But taking a look at the Red Bull Clean Air breakdown overall, it was Verstappen who was 2/10 faster in Clean Air in stint number 1, but Perez who was quicker in stint number 2. But bear in mind, Verstappen didn't complete too many laps on stint number 2. Where if we take a look at their quarter distribution, we can see that Perez set so many Clean Air laps in the final quarter, which are going to be significantly quicker than those set in the second and the third quarter. And then here is their breakdown comparing their Clean Air lap pace to their overall lap times without Clean Air laps. Then from Red Bull, we can take a look at Ferrari, but unfortunately there isn't any data to take a look at between the two teammates, as Carlos Sainz retired on lap number 1. So we will now take a look at McLaren and the battle between Daniel Ricciardo in the blue and Lando Norris in the orange. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 39.7% of the Grand Prix, it was Daniel Ricciardo who was the faster of the two McLarens, and therefore for 60.3% it was Lando Norris in the orange. where once again we can see in stint number 1 the two drivers being dead even, the gap holding at 1 second up until the first safety car period. They are then dead even once again in stint number 2, with the gap also holding at 1 second. However, after the virtual safety car period, Lando Norris is actually able to open up just a small little gap and rises it to 4 seconds, the largest that it had ever been this Grand Prix. But taking a look at McLaren's telemetry trace between the two fastest laps of Lando Norris in the orange and Daniel Ricciardo in the black, we can actually see that they were very, very quick. With just a 0.2 difference between the two drivers, there really isn't too much to pinpoint. But what we can see is that there is a nice steady decrease in the speed into the corners for Lando Norris compared to Daniel Ricciardo, who has a much more aggressive corner entry style, which we can see here on the throttle trace as a percentage, where Lando Norris is coming off of the throttle much smoother and much earlier into the corner, but then both drivers are actually getting onto the throttle in the same manner. So this is where the majority of the lap time is lying for Lando Norris. And taking a look at McLaren's clean air lap breakdown overall, we can see in stint number 1 it was Norris who was the faster driver, and the same in stint number 2, but not by as significant a margin. But taking a look at their quarter distribution, we can see that it is actually fairly similar, with a couple more laps set in the second quarter for Lando Norris than Daniel Ricciardo, but not too many. So looking at their overall pace, we can see that Ricciardo across the whole race distance was just about quicker than Lando Norris. And then taking a look at the overall traffic breakdown, we can see in stint number 2 they lost a significant amount in traffic, Lando Norris losing 3.5 tenths and Daniel Ricciardo losing 1.5 tenths. But in stint number 1 they were actually quicker outside of clean air, which doesn't happen too often. But then from McLaren we can take a look at Alpine and the battle between Fernando Alonso in the dark blue and Esteban Ocon in the white. We can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 61.4% of the Grand Prix, it was Esteban Ocon in the white who was the faster car, and therefore for 38.6% it was Fernando Alonso. Where much like the McLaren drivers, they were dead even in stint number 1, with the gap holding at around 2 seconds until the safety car period. However, in stint number 2, where Fernando Alonso actually gets the jump on Esteban Ocon, we can see that he opens up the gap closer to around 8 seconds by the virtual safety car period. However, Alonso opts to pit during this virtual safety car period and unfortunately is not able to close the gap to Esteban Ocon. In fact, it actually exponentially rises in Ocon's favour, with Fernando Alonso having to take a second pit stop and go on to a third stint, which ultimately completely ruins his race. But taking a look at the Alpine telemetry trace between the two drivers, with Fernando Alonso in the light blue and Esteban Ocon in the black, there was actually quite a significant time difference between the two drivers, with Alonso setting his fastest lap of a 1 minute 20.8 and Ocon setting a 1 minute 22.4. And we can see that pretty much everywhere Fernando Alonso is carrying so much more speed on corner entry, during the corner, and then on corner exit. However, interestingly, during the turn 9 and 10 chicane, and then the turn 12 and 13 corner complex, he actually comes off of the throttle much more than Esteban Ocon. However, he does carry significantly more speed than the Frenchman. But moving away from the telemetry trace for the Alpines and taking a look at their clean air lap breakdown, we can see that Alonso was significantly faster in stint number 1 and then not as fast in stint number 2, but bear in mind he only had 4 clean air laps compared to 11 for Esteban Ocon. We're taking a look at their quarter distribution. Ocon actually had significant amounts in the first quarter compared to Fernando Alonso, whereas the second, third and fourth quarters are actually fairly comparable. Then taking a look at their overall traffic breakdown, we can see that they lost a significant amount of time in stint number 1, Alonso losing an average of 6 tenths per lap in traffic, and Ocon losing 1.5 tenths. Then from Alpine, we'll now take a look at Alfa Tauri and the battle between Pierre Gasly in the black and Yuki Tsunoda in the white. And splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 31.6% of the Grand Prix, it was Yuki Tsunoda in the white who was the faster Alfa Tauri, and therefore for 68.4% it was Pierre Gasly in the black. And once again, much like pretty much every team we have looked at, they were dead even in stint number 1, with the gap albeit a little bit fluctuating, but holding around 3 to 4 seconds. This was of course up until the first safety car period, where then stint number 2, the gap actually rises to 5 seconds in Pierre Gasly's favour, and then across stint number 3, where there were a couple of inconsistent lap times for Yuki Tsunoda, which were probably due to blue flags, the gap actually rised all the way to 15 seconds. Then taking a look at the telemetry trace between the two Alfa Tauris, with Pierre Gasly being in the slightly dark grey and then Yuki Tsunoda being in the black. I might have to change these colours in the future. Once again, there was quite a large 6/10 difference between the two drivers in Pierre Gasly's favour, and we can see that he does carry an enormous amount more speed into the turn 9 and 10 chicane than Yuki Tsunoda. However, interestingly, into turn 1 and into turn 3, he doesn't carry anywhere near as much speed into the corners. But through the tricky turns 12 and 13 complex, he actually does carry quite a lot more speed than Yuki Tsunoda, which we can actually see here down in the throttle trace just below the speed trace. But taking a look at AlphaTauri's clean air lap breakdown, we can see that Gasly was quicker in both stints by 2.5 tenths in stint number 1 on the mediums and half a second on the hards. But taking a look at their quarter distribution, it is fairly comparable apart from the 10 and 3 clean air laps set respectively for Tsunoda and Gasly in the third quarter. And this is potentially where Tsunoda finds his advantage over the full race distance compared to the overall stint breakdown. But taking a look at the traffic breakdown, we can see that they lost roughly 3 tenths in pretty much every stint for both drivers. Then from AlphaTauri we can take a look at Aston Martin and the battle between Sebastian Vettel in the dark green and Lance Stroll in the light green. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 27.3% of the laps raced together, it was Lance Stroll in the lime green who was the faster driver, and therefore for 72.7% it was Sebastian Vettel. But ultimately there isn't too much to pinpoint between the two Aston Martin drivers, apart from an on-track overtake and then the gap holding at around 2 seconds, right up until Sebastian Vettel's retirement. Now I'll just pull up the telemetry trace between the two drivers, but as there was such a significant pace delta between the two as Vettel retired really early on, there's no point in analysing this lap. And then once again, due to the fact that Vettel completed so little laps and especially lap times set in the first quarter of this Grand Prix, there is no point in doing a clean air lap breakdown between the two drivers. So we will now take a look at Williams and the battle between Alex Albon in the white and Nicholas Latifi in the blue. We can split their percentage pace difference down the middle and see that for 67.7% of the Grand Prix it was Albon in the white who was the faster car, and therefore for 33.3% of laps raced together it was Nicholas Latifi. Now as usual in stint number 1 right up until the safety car period they are pretty much dead even, although Nicholas Latifi comes in for a very early pit stop. However, in stint number 2 Albon slightly stretches his legs, rising the gap to around 10 seconds. However, directly after the virtual safety car, where Alex Albon's hard tyre advantage should have completely been destroyed due to them cooling down so much, he actually goes a full second, and sometimes almost a second and a half, quicker than Nicholas Latifi, and manages to rise the gap from lap 40 at 10 seconds to 30 seconds at the checkered flag. This is something that just shouldn't have happened at all. Nicholas Latifi is on much fresher tyres than Alex Albon, who has just done a virtual safety car period on old hards which would have completely lost all of their temperature. So for an enormous 1 second pace delta consistently to open up between both drivers, that is extremely significant for Alex Albon and extremely damning for Nicholas Latifi. But taking a look at the telemetry trace between the two drivers, with Albon in the blue and Latifi in the black, there's once again quite a large pace difference between the two drivers of 1.3 seconds in Albon's favour, which we can again see in pretty much every single corner of this Grand Prix. He's carrying much more speed into the corners and he's carrying much more speed on the exit of the corners. as we can see here in the throttle trace, where he comes off of the throttle much later than Nicholas Latifi, and he picks up the throttle much earlier and much harder. Apart from the turn 11, 12 and 13 complex, where he actually comes fully off of the throttle compared to Nicholas Latifi, who does not. But with the telemetry trace of the two Williams all done and dusted, there isn't a point in taking a look at the clean air lap breakdown and the stint breakdown, as Albon's stint number 1 was 57 laps of a 58 lap Grand Prix. So penultimately we will take a look at the Alfa Romeos and the battle between Valtteri Bottas in the red and Guan Yu Zhou in the white. We can split this percentage pace difference down the middle and see that for 36.2% of the Grand Prix it was Zhou in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 63.8% it was Valtteri Bottas in the red. Once again in stint number 1 they were pretty much dead even, with the gap holding at around 3 seconds. Then at stint number 2, after the first safety car period, again the gap is staying at around 5 seconds. And then at stint number 3, the gap slightly rises a little bit up to around 10 seconds, with quite a lot of inconsistent lap times for both drivers. Again, this could be because of blue flags, but I'm not 100% sure. Then taking a look at the Alfa Romeo lap trace, where Valtteri Bottas is in the red and Guan Yu Zhou is in the black. There is again a 9/10 pace difference between these two drivers, where quite a lot of the time is actually gained in sector number 1 for Valtteri Bottas, where he carries roughly 15 to 20 kilometers an hour much more speed into turns number 1 and turn number 3 than Guan Yu Zhou. However, heading into turn number 11, he doesn't carry anywhere near as much speed, but by this point he has already built up quite a large pace delta. Then taking a look at the clean air lap breakdown between the two, there is a large difference between Bottas and Guan Yu Zhou. But taking a look at their quarter distribution, we can actually see that the Alfa Romeos didn't really set that many lap times at all in clean air, with just 8 for Valtteri Bottas and 11 for Guan Yu Zhou in a 58 lap Grand Prix. With their traffic breakdown looking a bit like this, both drivers losing quite a bit of time in stint number 1 and stint number 2, but again, there isn't a large pool of clean air laps to choose from. So finally, we will now take a look at Haas and the battle between Mick Schumacher in the white and Kevin Magnussen in the grey. We can split their percentage pace difference down the middle and see that for 54.4% of the Grand Prix it was Kevin Magnussen in the grey who was the faster driver, and therefore for 45.6% it was Mick Schumacher in the white. And as is the trend of pretty much every team that we've looked at so far, in stint number 1 they were literally dead even, nothing to separate them until the first safety car period. Then in stint number 2, they were again pretty much dead even, although the gap has now risen to a little over 5 seconds after the safety car confusion. Then in stint number 3, there is again a couple of inconsistent lap times and actually a few positional changes on track between the two drivers, with eventually Mick Schumacher coming out on top of Kevin Magnussen. But taking a look at the telemetry data between the two drivers, with Kevin Magnussen in the white and Mick Schumacher in the black, we can see by the delta trace at the top they actually swapped and changed who was actually leading, with the overall difference in their fastest lap times being just half a tenth. Where we can see for a large portion of this Grand Prix they are dead even, right up until the run down to turn 11, where Mick Schumacher carries significantly more speed into the corner than Kevin Magnussen. So it is very possible that on this lap in particular for Mick Schumacher, he did have DRS down to turn 11. But taking a look at their clean air lap breakdown between the two drivers, we can see that Magnussen was quicker in both stints. However, with a quarter distribution that looks a bit like this, again, it's not overly comparable between the two drivers, with a large portion of Magnussen's clean air laps coming in the third and the fourth quarters. With their traffic breakdown looking a bit like this, with Magnussen losing 0.6 per lap in traffic in stint number 1, and Mick Schumacher losing 0.2 in stint number 2. And there we go, there is the end of the data analysis for the Australian Grand Prix, all concluded. That was a little bit of a longer episode than usual, mainly due to the addition of the race telemetry analysis. If you guys liked that addition, then please do let me know in the comments down below, or if you feel there's something I can chop and change, or potentially make 2 videos out of it, as I think, how long have I been recording for? Around 45 to 50 minutes. that's going to be a little bit of a long episode. So if you do have any suggestions for improvements to this series, then please do let me know in the comments below. I'm always interested in hearing any of your guys' improvements. Now I have to say a huge thank you to my 2 Patreon supporters, Sue Dawson and Elliot Crosson, for their continued support over there. If you would like to support me financially, there are a few options that are all down in the description below, over on Patreon, or YouTube channel membership, or just a PayPal donation link. Any form of financial support will receive a shout out at the end of the video, so once again thank you to Sue Dawson and to Elliot Crosson. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next video with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.